Trust is like glass, once shattered, it can never be truly fixed. We dive into the raw stories of betrayal and the slow, painful process of picking up the pieces. Witness the emotional truth. Subscribe today and stay connected to every heart-touching chapter.
My husband grabbed my wrist across the dinner table and told me I needed to learn my place right there in front of his entire family, with his mother's good china still warm from the oven. 30 seconds later, he watched me pick up my purse, pull out an envelope, and set it beside his plate. He had no idea that envelope had been 3 years in the making. I should have known the evening would end this way. His parents' anniversary dinners always had a way of bringing out the worst in my husband Daniel. Something about sitting at that same mahogany table where he'd grown up watching his father command the room turned him into a version of himself he didn't bother hiding anymore. His father Gerald would pour the wine and start holding court, and Daniel would sit up a little straighter, nod a little more eagerly, and by the time the main course arrived, he'd forgotten I was a person at all. I'd been married to Daniel for 7 years. Long enough to know the script by heart. Long enough to have memorized every warning sign I'd spent the first 2 years convincing myself weren't real. That particular Saturday in October, his mother Margaret had made her pot roast, the one she brought out for birthdays and anniversaries and any occasion where she wanted the family to feel like everything was exactly as it should be. She'd asked me to arrive early to help set the table, which I did, just as I always did, because that was my role. Daniel's wife, the quiet one, the one who smiled at the right moments and refilled glasses without being asked and never, ever contradicted anyone at that table. I had arrived early that evening for reasons that had nothing to do with pot roast. The trouble started, as it often did, with something small. I mentioned a project I'd been leading at the firm I'm a CPA, have been for 12 years, and I'd just closed the biggest audit of my career. I didn't make a speech about it. I mentioned it the way you mention good news to people you love. Briefly. Between the bread basket and the salad. Daniel's father Gerald set down his fork. "That's a lot of pressure for a woman to carry," he said, in the tone he reserved for statements he believed were generous. "Especially when there's a household to manage." I said something measured and polite. I always did. Daniel looked at me the way he'd been looking at me for 3 years, like I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome in a conversation she hadn't been invited to join. "Nicole," he said, using my name the way someone uses a warning, "let's not make tonight about work." I smiled. I let it go. The way I had learned to let things go. But Gerald wasn't finished. He swirled his wine and began the speech I'd heard a dozen variations of about the natural order of things. About how a household with 2 competing careers was a household without a center. About how his own marriage had thrived because Margaret understood her priorities. Margaret, sitting across from me, cut her pot roast into very small pieces and looked at her plate. I looked at my sister-in-law Renee, Daniel's younger sister, who was pressing her lips together the way she did when she disagreed with something and had decided not to say so. I made the mistake of speaking. "I think a marriage works best when both people are building something together," I said. "Shared goals, shared decisions." The table went quiet in the specific way that tables go quiet when someone has said something that cannot be unsaid. Daniel's hand closed around my wrist. Not hard enough to bruise. Just hard enough to make a point. Just hard enough for everyone at that table to see it and understand what it meant. "I think," he said, his voice low and very controlled, "that it's time you remembered where you are." I looked at his hand on my wrist. I looked at Gerald, who had picked his fork back up. I looked at Margaret, whose eyes had not moved from her plate. I looked at Renee, who had looked away. And I thought, there it is. The final piece. I had been waiting for a moment that was witnessed. A moment that was unambiguous. A moment that would be remembered by everyone in this room no matter what was said later. I set down my own fork. Very slowly. Very deliberately. "You're right," I said to Daniel. "You've always known exactly where I stand." I reached into the pocket of my blazer. I had worn the blazer specifically for this, for the pockets, and I placed the envelope on the table beside his plate. "What is this?" he said. Not a question. "Open it," I said, "or don't. But I'd suggest your father read it too." I stood up, smoothed my blazer, and looked at Margaret one more time. Her eyes had finally come up from her plate. There was something in them I hadn't seen before. Or maybe something I had seen and never let myself name. "Thank you for dinner, Margaret," I said. The pot roast was wonderful. I walked out of that dining room, through the front door, and into the cool October air, and I did not look back. My car was parked 3 houses down, which was not an accident. I had parked there because I wanted to walk those extra 50 feet, slowly, giving myself time to breathe, giving my hands time to stop shaking. Because despite everything, despite the 3 years of preparation, despite every document saved and every dollar accounted for, my hands were shaking. That's the part no one tells you about executing a plan you've spent years building. The plan doesn't stop your hands from shaking. It just means you shook long before this moment, alone, at a laptop at 11 o'clock at night. So that by the time the moment arrived, you could keep your voice steady. I sat in my car and let myself shake for exactly 4 minutes. Then I drove to my apartment. I had rented it 8 months ago. A 2-bedroom in a building 20 minutes from the house Daniel and I shared, the mortgage on which was, as of that afternoon, no longer a problem I needed to solve. I'd been moving things there gradually, a box from my office here, a bag from the back of my closet there, never enough at once to be noticed, always on days when Daniel was traveling for work. My grandmother's jewelry had been there since March. My backup hard drives had been there since April. My professional certifications and a framed photo of my college graduation, the one Daniel had always kept in the office he'd claimed as his own, had been there since July. The furniture was modest and entirely mine. Every piece purchased with cash I had set aside from my own accounts over 3 years, never more than $200 at a time, always documented, always above board. I was a CPA. I knew exactly how to move money in ways that were perfectly legal and perfectly invisible to someone who had stopped paying attention to the details. Daniel had stopped paying attention to a great many details. I made myself a cup of tea and opened my laptop and looked at the folders I had organized over 3 years with the same precision I brought to every audit I'd ever conducted. Year 1 had been about understanding the full picture. When I first noticed the discrepancies, a pattern of transfers out of our joint account that didn't match any expense, I recognized I didn't confront Daniel. I documented. I created a shadow ledger, tracking every transaction against every stated expense, and within 4 months I had identified just over $60,000 that had moved from our shared finances into accounts I had no access to. I cross-referenced the dates. Every single transfer had cleared within 2 weeks of my quarterly bonus hitting our account. I was a forensic accountant by training. I knew what that pattern meant. Year 2 had been about building the case. I started keeping records of every conversation where Daniel made financial decisions without my input, and then presented them as joint decisions after the fact. I documented the evening he canceled my name from the lease on our vacation property without mentioning it to me until I found the paperwork by accident. I documented the meeting with our financial advisor, where Daniel spoke for 45 minutes without once directing a question to me, and when I asked about our retirement allocations, he said, "In front of the advisor, Nicole handles the day-to-day. I handle the strategy." The advisor had glanced at me and said nothing. I had smiled and said nothing. That night I sent myself a time-stamped email with a detailed summary of the meeting. I had hundreds of those emails. I also documented the smaller things, because I had learned from research, from speaking carefully and anonymously with a domestic violence advocate, that financial abuse lives in the accumulation of small things. The way Daniel reviewed my credit card statements but considered his own private. The way he described my salary as "you're spending money in front of friends." The way he had, 3 years ago, suggested I cut back my hours at the firm because it was creating tension at home, and when I didn't, the tension had arrived anyway, applied in other ways. Year 3 had been about building my exit. The envelope I'd left beside Daniel's plate contained a single document. A legal summary, prepared by my attorney over the past 6 months, detailing the financial discrepancies I had identified and the accounts I had traced them to. It did not contain everything I had, it contained enough. Enough for Daniel to understand that I had spent 3 years watching, and that the story he had been telling himself about our marriage, the one where he was the architect and I was the interior, was not the story that existed on paper. The second document in the envelope was a note to Gerald. It was 3 sentences. It referenced, by date and amount, the consulting fees Daniel had been paying to Gerald's former business for the past 4 years. Gerald's business, which had been dissolved in 2021. Consulting fees that had been, according to our joint tax returns, deducted as legitimate business expenses. I had not included this in the legal summary. It was a separate note, handwritten, because I had wanted Gerald to understand that this had been seen by a human being who had sat at his table and smiled and refilled his wine glass, not just a spreadsheet. My phone started ringing at 9:47 that night. Daniel. I let it go to voicemail. Gerald. Voicemail. Daniel again. Voicemail. Margaret, at 11:15, which surprised me. I let that one go too, but I listened to the message later. Her voice was very quiet. She said she hoped I was safe, that was all. The next morning, I was up at 6. My attorney, Carol, had been briefed for months. At 8 a.m. exactly, as we had planned, she filed the divorce petition. 30 minutes later, she sent a formal letter to Daniel's firm. He was a partner at a mid-sized commercial real estate law firm, outlining the financial irregularities she had identified in our shared accounts and notifying them that the documentation had been preserved and would be disclosed as required in the divorce proceedings. She sent a separate letter to the IRS. At 9:15, Daniel rang my apartment buzzer. I had given him the address in the divorce petition. I had known he would come. I had prepared for it the same way I had prepared for everything else, not by hoping it wouldn't happen, but by deciding exactly what I would do when it did. I pressed the intercom. "The building has cameras in the lobby and the hallway," I said. "My attorney has been notified that you might come. Whatever you'd like to say, you're welcome to say it through the intercom." There was a silence. "Nicole." His voice sounded different from the night before. Smaller, somehow. "This is, you need to think about what you're doing. We can fix this." "I've been thinking about what I'm doing for 3 years, I said. "I've thought about it very carefully. The letters Carol sent, do you understand what that could do to my practice? To my father?" "I understand exactly what it could do," I said. "I'm a forensic accountant, Daniel. I've always understood exactly what it could do. That's why I waited until I was certain." Another silence. "You're being vindictive." "I'm being precise," I said. "Those are different things." I heard him exhale. I heard the shift in his breath that I had learned, over 7 years, meant he was moving from negotiation to something else. "You can't do this to my family," he said. "One word from me to the IRS, and your father already has that word," I said. "What happens next is entirely up to how you choose to proceed. Carol has my complete instructions." I released the intercom button. I listened to the sound of him leaving. Then I went to make more tea and sat at my kitchen table and let myself feel, for the first time, something I could only describe as stillness. The days that followed moved in waves. There was the chaos, the calls, the counter-threats, the letter from Daniel's attorney that arrived 4 days later and which Carol read, noted several significant problems with, and replied to in language I could only describe as efficient. There were the mutual friends who reached out with variations of "I just want to make sure you're okay" that were actually variations of "Daniel told us his side and we're not sure what to think." To all of them I sent the same 3-word response. "Talk to Carol." There were also the surprises. Renee called on day 3. She had been the one at the dinner table who looked away, and I had not expected to hear from her, and when I saw her name on my screen I almost didn't answer. But I did. "I should have said something years ago," she said. She wasn't crying, but her voice had the particular flatness of someone who had made themselves stop. "I watched him become our father, and I told myself it wasn't my business." "You're saying something now," I told her. "Is there anything I can do?" There was, as it turned out. Renee had her own memories, dinners, holidays, conversations she had witnessed, and she had documented none of them. But she remembered them, and in time she would write them down, and what she wrote would be useful in ways neither of us fully anticipated. That first phone call. Margaret called again on day 5. This time I answered. She didn't apologize. I hadn't expected her to, and I didn't need her to. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I said yes. Not because I owed her anything, but because of what I had seen in her eyes at that dinner table, that look I had finally let myself name. We met at a place neither of us had been before, neutral ground, far from anything that connected us to the family we had both navigated for different lengths of time. She ordered black coffee. She had taken off the diamond ring Gerald had given her for their 30th anniversary. I filed Monday, she said. Gerald doesn't know yet. I looked at her. This woman I had spent 7 years watching cut her food into very small pieces and look at her plate. The attorney says it'll be straightforward, she said. His finances aren't as organized as he always believed. No, I agreed. They're not. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I spent 40 years thinking that was just how marriage worked, she said. That the discomfort was the price of stability. You know it isn't now, I said. I think I knew for longer than I admitted. She looked up at me. Watching you walk out of that dining room, I've been thinking about it every day since. You didn't look back. I'd already said everything I needed to say, I said. I just said it on paper. She smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, but it was real, and it made her look like someone I wanted to know better. The professional fallout was significant and swift. Daniel's firm placed him on administrative leave within 2 weeks, pending their own internal review of the financial discrepancies my attorney's letter had referenced. Gerald's former business partners, some of whom had not known the company was dissolved, began asking questions that Gerald was not prepared to answer. Daniel's LinkedIn post about the situation, a lengthy, poorly worded defense of himself that he posted late one night and deleted by morning, was screenshot and shared among enough mutual connections that the deletion accomplished nothing. His career, which he had spent 7 years describing as the reason our household ran the way it did, turned out to be significantly less stable than he had believed. Mine, by contrast, was doing exceptionally well. I had been holding back at work. I see that clearly now, the way I had learned to soften my recommendations, to frame my findings tentatively, to never let my own expertise outpace Daniel's comfort with my success. The week after I left, I stopped doing that. I presented findings the way I had always known they should be presented. My managing partner pulled me aside after a client meeting and asked, with genuine curiosity, what had changed. Nothing's changed, I told her. I just stopped editing. She promoted me to senior partner 6 months later. The work I found most meaningful, though, was not in the office. It started when a colleague from another firm reached out after hearing, through the professional network, a partial version of my story. She was trying to leave her own marriage, and she didn't know how to begin. We had coffee. Then I had coffee with someone she referred to me. Then there were 3 more, and then a dozen. And I started taking notes, not on their stories, which were theirs, but on the practical questions they all had in common. How do you document financial control without alerting the person who's controlling you? What counts as evidence? How do you build a separate financial identity from inside a marriage where your finances are monitored? How do you find an attorney when the household credit cards send alerts to a shared account? I had spent 3 years finding answers to those questions. I had written most of them down. Carol, my attorney, connected me with a domestic violence organization that ran legal and financial literacy workshops. I wasn't a counselor and I wasn't a lawyer. I was a forensic accountant who had made a very detailed study of my own situation, and it turned out that was exactly the kind of expertise the room needed. Renee started coming with me after a few months. She had her own perspective, what it looked like from the outside, how the family system had maintained itself, how easy it was to mistake your own silence for neutrality. She was a better speaker than I was, honestly. The room always responded to her. One evening, driving home from a workshop, she said, "Daniel used to talk about legacy. Dad too. They were always talking about legacy." "I remember," I said. "This is the legacy," she said. "Obviously." I smiled at the road. "Obviously," I said. Daniel made 2 more attempts at contact after the buzzer incident, both through his attorney and both deflected by Carol with the efficiency I had come to rely on. The divorce was finalized 9 months after I walked out of that dining room. The settlement reflected the documentation I had assembled over 3 years. Daniel did not contest it, which Carol had anticipated and I had planned for. Margaret's divorce was finalized 3 months after mine. She sold the house, the one with the mahogany table and the good china, and moved into an apartment not far from mine. She enrolled in a painting class at the community center. She had always wanted to paint, she told me one afternoon over coffee. Gerald had told her it was a waste of time. She was, it turned out, very good. She brought me one of her first finished pieces, a small canvas, mostly blues and grays, with a shaft of light coming in from the right side of the frame. She said she'd painted it the morning after her divorce was final. I hung it in my office, where I could see it from my desk. 1 year after that dinner, I gave a presentation at a regional conference for financial professionals on the identification and documentation of financial abuse in domestic partnerships. The room held about 200 people. Several of them came up afterward to ask where they could access the documentation framework I described. I had been writing it up for months, in the evenings, in the apartment that was entirely mine, in the time that was entirely mine. I wasn't ready to call it a book yet. But it was getting there. I stepped off the stage and checked my phone. There was a message from Margaret. A photo of a new painting, larger this time, more color. A woman standing at a window with her back to the viewer and the whole bright outside spread in front of her. "First one I've shown anyone," she wrote. "The gallery downtown wants 4 more." I stood in the hallway of that conference center and thought about the dinner table, the good china, the weight of his hand on my wrist. The moment I had placed that envelope beside his plate and understood that the ending I had built was finally beginning. He had wanted to put me in my place. It turned out my place was here, on a stage, at a desk, in an apartment full of furniture I had chosen myself, drinking coffee I had bought without asking permission, building something that would outlast every version of the story he had ever told about me. The best revenge, I had learned, is not the moment the other person loses. It is the morning you wake up and realize you have stopped measuring yourself against them entirely. It is the moment you understand that the life they tried to limit has grown so far past those limits that the limits are no longer visible. I walked back into the conference room. There was more work to do.